David Klein's name appeared on a federal witness list in late February 2019, a detail that would ripple through the corridors of power in Philadelphia with devastating consequences that neither he nor his family could have fully anticipated. The 53-year-old accountant had worked for the Greco family's construction empire for nearly 2 decades, meticulously documenting financial transactions that appeared legitimate on the surface but concealed a vast network of money laundering, bid rigging, and extortion that stretched from Center City, Philadelphia to Atlantic City and into the lucrative construction contracts along the I-95 corridor. His corner office on Market Street offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, the afternoon light catching the buildings where his calculations had helped funnel millions of dollars through shell companies and fraudulent invoices. By March, he would never see that view again, would never sit in the leather chair his wife had given him for his 40th birthday, would never attend another Phillies game with his son or watch his daughter play basketball at the high school gymnasium where he had spent countless Friday nights cheering from the bleachers. The decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors came after months of internal struggle, late nights reviewing ledgers that documented crimes he could no longer ignore, and the weight of knowing that his silence made him complicit in an organization that had destroyed competitors, silenced union representatives, and corrupted public officials across 2 states. When FBI Special Agent Rebecca Duvall first approached him outside his daughter's basketball game at Radnor High School in January, Klein had refused to even acknowledge her presence, walking past her to his silver Volvo with his hands shaking and his mind racing through everything he had buried for years. But the second meeting, arranged in a coffee shop in Ardmore on a cold Tuesday morning, changed everything in ways that would reshape not just his life, but the entire Philadelphia organized crime landscape. Agent Duvall arrived with documentation that demonstrated the federal government's comprehensive understanding of the Greco organization's operations, and more importantly, Klein's role within it. She showed him surveillance photos of Vincent Greco meeting with known associates of the Russian mob outside a restaurant in Ben Salem. Documents indicating the Greco organization had orchestrated the disappearance of a union representative named Anthony Calabrese, who had threatened to expose their practices of forcing contractors to use overpriced Greco-supplied materials, and evidence suggesting Klein's own signature had been forged on documents he never reviewed, setting him up to take the fall for tax fraud and money laundering charges that could send him to federal prison for 20 years. The implications were clear and terrifying. The organization he had served loyally for 2 decades was preparing to sacrifice him to protect the higher-level operators, the men who made decisions in private offices and rarely left paper trails. Duvall explained that Greco's nephew, Peter Russo, had already been arrested on unrelated charges and was making deals with prosecutors, and that a forensic accountant working with the FBI had found discrepancies in Klein's work that could only be explained by either criminal intent or manipulation by someone above him. Klein sat in that coffee shop for 3 hours, watching through the window as commuters hurried past in the February cold, knowing that his entire life was balanced on the decision he would make in the next few days. He thought about Julie and the stability she deserved after supporting him through his father's long illness and death. He thought about Ashley's basketball talent and the college opportunities she was earning through hard work and dedication. He thought about Michael, who had just declared a business major at Penn State, and talked about following his father into finance. And he thought about the union representative whose body had never been found, whose family still waited for answers, and whose disappearance Klein had facilitated by providing alibis and falsified time records for Greco associates on the day Calabrese vanished. If you're finding this story compelling, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more true stories like this one to light. The decision to enter the witness security program was made on March 12, 2019, following a tense 6-hour meeting at the U.S. Marshal's service office in Center City, Philadelphia, where Klein sat in a windowless conference room with fluorescent lights that made everyone look pale and exhausted. Deputy Marshal Frank Garrett, a 28-year veteran of witness protection operations who had relocated everyone from mob accountants to cartel enforcers, explained the reality of WITSEC with brutal honesty that left no room for illusions or false hope. Klein's wife Julie, a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, who had built relationships with colleagues over 15 years and earned the respect and trust of countless families, would have to abandon her career and the specialized skills she had developed in neonatal care. His daughter Ashley, a junior at Radnor High School, who had just received early interest from Division I basketball programs, including Villanova, Temple, and UConn, would have to disappear from the recruiting circuit entirely, effectively ending the athletic career she had been building since elementary school. His son Michael, a freshman at Penn State who had found his community and was thriving academically with a 3.7 GPA in his first semester, would need to withdraw immediately and relocate under a new identity to a different institution where his credits might not transfer and his fraternity connections would vanish overnight. The financial compensation from the federal government would average around $60,000 to help them restart their lives in a new location. But Klein's comfortable suburban existence in a 4-bedroom colonial in Wayne, his position on the local school board, his membership at the country club where he played golf every Saturday morning, his entire social network built over decades would evaporate overnight as if he had never existed. Julie sat beside him, her hands trembling as she processed the magnitude of what cooperation meant, her face drawn and her eyes filling with tears as Garrett methodically dismantled every assumption she had about their future. She asked him if there was any alternative, any way to protect David without destroying the lives of their children who had done nothing wrong and deserved to finish their educations and pursue their dreams. Garrett's response was measured but definitive, delivered in the flat tone of someone who had given this speech many times before. Vincent Greco's organization had a long reach, deep connections within law enforcement agencies at the local and state level, and a documented history of eliminating problems permanently through methods that ranged from staged accidents to professional hits. 3 other potential witnesses in related cases had died under suspicious circumstances in the past 5 years, including a bookkeeper who drove off a bridge in South Jersey, a construction foreman who suffered a fatal heart attack that the coroner later suggested might have been induced by drugs, and a city inspector who was found shot in an apparent robbery that had all the hallmarks of an execution. Klein's testimony could dismantle an enterprise worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually, could expose corruption that reached into City Hall and the state legislature, and could destroy the freedom of men who had spent their entire lives building power and would use every resource at their disposal to prevent that outcome. They would come for him with patience and planning, and they would not stop until he was silenced permanently. The safe house was located in a quiet residential neighborhood in Wilmington, Delaware, approximately 30 miles from Philadelphia, but psychologically a world away from the life Klein had known. The 2-story colonial with beige vinyl siding and a small backyard bordered by a chain-link fence could have belonged to any middle-class family struggling to maintain their foothold in an increasingly expensive region. The house sat on a street called Maple Ridge Drive, lined with similar homes where children rode bicycles in the late afternoon and neighbors maintained polite but distant relationships that involved waves from driveways but rarely progressed to genuine friendship. Klein arrived there on March 18, 2019, accompanied by Deputy Marshal Garrett and a relocation specialist named Patricia Bowman, who would serve as his primary contact during the transition period and would be responsible for ensuring he understood the protocols that would govern every aspect of his existence for the foreseeable future. The house had been furnished with generic furniture from a discount warehouse, nothing that carried memories or personal significance, nothing that would make the space feel like a home rather than a temporary holding facility. The living room contained a brown fabric sofa that smelled faintly of chemicals, a glass-topped coffee table with metal legs, and a television mounted on the wall that received basic cable channels. The kitchen had been stocked with non-perishable food items, basic cooking supplies, and a coffee maker that Klein would come to rely on during the long, sleepless nights ahead. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms weighted with simple bed frames and mattresses still wrapped in plastic, bureaus with empty drawers that would soon hold the limited possessions Klein and his family could bring from their former lives. Bowman explained the protocols with clinical precision, going through a printed manual that outlined every rule and restriction that would govern Klein's new existence. He was not to contact anyone from his former life without prior written authorization from the Marshal Service, not to venture beyond a 5-mile radius of the safe house without an escort and documented reason, not to use his real name in any context or discuss any details of his past with anyone he encountered, not to access social media or conduct internet searches related to his former associates or the ongoing investigation. His new identity documents were still being processed by specialists who created entire life histories, complete with social security numbers, employment records, and educational credentials that could withstand scrutiny. But he would soon become Daniel Kaufman, a financial consultant from Buffalo, New York, who had relocated to Delaware for a position with a small accounting firm that was actually a federal front operation. The backstory had been carefully constructed to align with his actual skills and knowledge, while obscuring his Philadelphia connections and the specialized expertise he had developed managing Greco's complex financial network. Julie and the children would join him after completing their own orientation sessions at a separate facility, and once Ashley finished the school year under supervised conditions, with federal agents monitoring her movements and ensuring she had no contact with anyone who might extract information about her father's whereabouts or intentions. For now, Klein was alone with his thoughts, his guilt about uprooting his family and destroying their futures, and a growing anxiety about the trial scheduled for September that would require him to face Vincent Greco and recite details of crimes he had enabled for 2 decades. The isolation in those first weeks was more oppressive than Klein had imagined possible during the planning meetings in Philadelphia. The safe house routine was built around security protocols that reduced human existence to its most basic elements: wake, eat, review documents, meet with prosecutors via secure video conference, exercise in the basement on a treadmill that faced a blank wall, eat again, sleep fitfully while listening to unfamiliar neighborhood sounds. Deputy Marshal Garrett visited 3 times per week, arriving in an unmarked sedan at irregular intervals to prevent pattern recognition that could compromise the location. During these visits, Garrett would review Klein's mental state, check the security systems, deliver supplies, and conduct what he called maintenance interviews to ensure Klein was adhering to protocols and not developing the dangerous habits that had compromised other witnesses in the past. The stories Garrett shared during these sessions painted a grim picture of witness protection failures. The organized crime informant who had called his mother on her birthday and was dead within a week, the drug cartel accountant who had posted a photo on social media that revealed enough background details for assassins to triangulate his location, the mob enforcer who had returned to his old neighborhood to visit his father's grave and was shot in the cemetery. These cautionary tales were meant to reinforce the absolute necessity of following every rule without exception, but they also deepened Klein's paranoia and sense that he was living in a prison of his own making. The recording device had been Klein's idea, a decision he made without consulting the marshals or the prosecutors who were building their case with meticulous attention to evidentiary standards. In early May 2019, as he sat in the safe house reviewing the thousands of pages of documents he would need to testify about, Klein became increasingly convinced that there were details he had forgotten, nuances in conversations with Greco's associates that could prove critical to the prosecution's case, but had faded from memory under the stress of relocation. He began recording himself on a small digital voice recorder he had found in the kitchen drawer, left behind by a previous occupant of the safe house and somehow missed during the standard sweep of the property. The recording started as simple memory exercises, Klein recounting meetings from years earlier in meticulous detail, describing the layout of Greco's private office in the construction company headquarters, where unrecorded conversations occurred away from the secretaries and lower-level employees, detailing the coded language used in emails when discussing illegal activities that could appear innocuous to outside observers but carried specific meanings within the organization. He described how concrete delivery meant cash payments to corrupt officials, how overtime adjustments indicated skimming from payroll to fund off-books operations, how supplier negotiations masked the extortion of subcontractors who were forced to accept Greco-controlled vendors at inflated prices or lose access to future projects. But as the recordings progressed over subsequent weeks, they evolved into something more personal and infinitely more dangerous than simple testimony preparation. Klein began to articulate suspicions he had never shared with federal investigators, theories about which law enforcement officials might be compromised by Greco's organization based on patterns he had observed over the years. He named names with dates and specific incidents, including Detective Luis Ferreira of the Philadelphia Police Department, who had always seemed to appear at construction sites just before federal inspectors arrived, giving Greco's crew time to hide equipment violations and remove workers who lacked proper documentation. He detailed Assistant District Attorney Catherine Reynolds, whose brother-in-law worked directly for Greco in the Property Acquisition Division, and whose prosecution of a rival construction company had been unusually aggressive, while Greco-related investigations seemed to stall in preliminary stages. Klein recounted a conversation he had overheard in 2017 during a private meeting in Greco's office, where Vincent had laughed about having insurance policies within multiple agencies, people who provided advance warning of investigations and helped redirect scrutiny toward competitors and minor players. The recorder became Klein's confessional, a repository for information that could either strengthen the prosecution's case exponentially or sign his own death warrant if it fell into the wrong hands, and revealed the full extent of his knowledge. By late June 2019, the isolation was corroding Klein's psychological stability in ways that concerned both Garrett and the prosecutors who met with him for trial preparation sessions. Julie and the children had joined him in early May, but the transition had been catastrophic for the family's cohesion and exposed fault lines that had existed beneath the surface of their apparently successful suburban life. Ashley had fallen into a deep depression after being forced to abandon not only her school and friends, but her entire basketball career, the scholarship offers and recruiting attention disappearing as she vanished from the circuit and coaches moved on to other prospects. She spent most days in her bedroom, refusing to engage with the online coursework that was supposed to allow her to finish her junior year and qualify for graduation. The therapist assigned by the Marshals Service diagnosed her with major depressive disorder and prescribed medication, but Ashley refused to take it, saying she didn't want to be numbed to the reality of what her father had done to the family. Michael had grown sullen and resentful, blaming his father explicitly and repeatedly for destroying their lives over what he called accounting problems that could have been solved by simply finding a new job years earlier when Klein first realized the nature of Greco's operations. He had been forced to withdraw from Penn State with a vague explanation about family medical issues, losing not just his classes and credits, but the friendships he had formed and the sense of independence he had just begun to enjoy. The relationship between Michael and his father deteriorated to the point where they barely spoke, communicating mainly through Julie, who tried desperately to hold the family together while dealing with her own trauma and loss. Julie had found part-time work at a medical clinic in Newcastle under her new identity as Jennifer Kaufman, but the work was far less challenging than her specialized neonatal nursing position had been, and she felt the loss of professional identity acutely. She spent evenings studying for certification exams that might allow her to practice at a higher level again, but the motivation was difficult to maintain when she knew they might have to relocate again after the trial or if the safe house was compromised. The family ate dinner together in silence most nights, each person locked in their own grief and resentment, the dream of safety and fresh starts revealed as hollow promises that couldn't compensate for everything they had sacrificed. Klein's relationship with Deputy Marshal Garrett had also deteriorated from professional cooperation to barely concealed mutual frustration. Garrett had become increasingly concerned about Klein's mental state, his tendency to ruminate obsessively about details of the case during their weekly check-ins, his questions about whether the prosecution was pursuing the law enforcement corruption angle Klein had mentioned in his initial debriefing sessions. On June 24th, during a routine supply run to a grocery store in Newcastle, Klein violated protocol by using his personal cell phone, which should have been permanently disabled, to search for news articles about the Greco investigation and see if there were any updates about the September trial date. Garrett discovered the breach during a standard review of the safe house's network activity and security logs, and he confronted Klein with barely contained fury that reflected not just anger about the specific violation, but frustration with Klein's inability to grasp the seriousness of the threats against him. The phone had been deactivated and should have been secure according to Klein's assurances, but the action demonstrated a recklessness and disregard for protocols that could compromise the entire operation and potentially expose not just Klein, but other witnesses in protection. Garrett issued a formal written warning that any further violations of any kind could result in Klein's removal from the program. A termination that would leave him vulnerable and unprotected against an organization that had demonstrated its willingness to kill anyone who threatened its operations. The threat only deepened Klein's paranoia and his growing conviction that he needed insurance of his own, evidence that could protect him if the federal government failed to keep its promises or if the trial somehow fell apart and left him exposed without recourse. The morning of July 11, 2019, began like any other morning in the established safe house routine that had governed the Klein family's existence for the past 2 months. Julie left at 7:30 for her shift at the medical clinic, kissing Klein on the cheek in a gesture that had become mechanical rather than affectionate, a remnant of their former life that persisted despite the emotional distance growing between them. Ashley and Michael were still asleep in their respective bedrooms, both having stayed up late the previous night, Ashley watching television shows on her laptop, and Michael playing video games as a way to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Klein had a scheduled check-in with Garrett at 10 o'clock, followed by an afternoon session with prosecutors who were flying in from Philadelphia to continue trial preparation and review the complex financial documents that would form the backbone of the government's case against Vincent Greco and 7 of his top associates. But when Garrett arrived at 9:55, pulling his unmarked sedan into the driveway and noticing immediately that something felt wrong in ways he couldn't quite articulate, he found the front door slightly ajar, moving gently in the humid summer breeze that carried the smell of cut grass from a neighbor's lawn. The security system had been disabled from the inside at approximately 8:15 that morning, according to the digital logs, using Klein's personal code rather than any indication of forced override or technical malfunction. Klein was gone, along with a small black backpack that he normally used for storing documents, his prescription medication for high blood pressure and anxiety, a bottle of water, several protein bars, and most significantly, the digital voice recorder that contained more than 40 hours of recordings Klein had made over the past 2 months. The systematic search of the property that Garrett conducted, while simultaneously calling for backup and activating emergency protocols, revealed no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle or violence, no indication whatsoever that Klein had been taken against his will by Greco associates or any other hostile actors. His wallet remained on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker, along with all the identification documents for Daniel Kaufman that had been so carefully constructed by federal specialists. A handwritten note addressed to Julie had been left on the dining room table, weighted down by a coffee mug so it wouldn't blow away if someone opened a window. The note explained in Klein's precise accountant's handwriting that he had to finish something he should have done months earlier, that he would return within 48 hours, and that she should trust him despite everything that had happened and all the ways he had failed to protect the family from the consequences of his choices. The note provided no details about his destination or his intentions, no explanation that would help Garrett understand what Klein was thinking or what objective he hoped to accomplish by abandoning the protection that stood between him and certain death. Garrett immediately activated emergency protocols that had been developed for exactly these situations, coordinating with FBI field offices across the Mid-Atlantic region, issuing alerts to local and state police departments, and providing Klein's description and the known details of his new identity to law enforcement agencies that might encounter him. But Klein had a 7-hour head start and apparently a clear plan that he had been developing without sharing any details with the people responsible for keeping him alive. The investigation into Klein's disappearance proceeded with desperate urgency as the hours stretched into days and the likelihood of finding him alive diminished with each passing moment. Garrett interviewed Julie extensively, reviewing every conversation she had with her husband in the days before he vanished, searching for any clue about his intentions or mental state that might indicate where he had gone or what he hoped to accomplish. She described Klein's increasing paranoia about the trial, his conviction that certain law enforcement officials couldn't be trusted, his frustration with what he perceived as the prosecution's unwillingness to pursue the full scope of Greco's corruption into official agencies. She mentioned the recordings Klein had been making, though she claimed she didn't know the full content or where he kept them, describing them as memory aids for testimony rather than understanding their true nature as potential evidence of law enforcement corruption. Ashley and Michael provided little additional information, both having maintained such distance from their father that they barely knew his daily routines or thought processes. The FBI deployed significant resources to the search, checking Klein's known associates from his former life in Philadelphia, monitoring his financial accounts for any activity, reviewing surveillance footage from transportation hubs and major highways, and coordinating with local police departments across Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, and Maryland. Agent Duval, who had been Klein's initial contact and felt personal responsibility for his decision to cooperate, worked nearly around the clock, reviewing every detail of the case for some indication of where Klein might have gone. The prosecutors prepared contingency plans for proceeding with the trial without Klein's live testimony, knowing that his recorded depositions and the documentary evidence might be sufficient for conviction, but would lack the emotional impact of a live witness describing the crimes from personal knowledge. 3 days after Klein's disappearance on July 14, 2019, a hiker discovered Klein's body in a wooded area near Valley Forge National Historical Park, approximately 20 miles from Philadelphia, and in the general vicinity of several locations that had significance in Klein's former life. He had been shot twice in the back of the head, execution style, the kind of professional killing that left no doubt about the perpetrator's identity or their message to anyone else considering cooperation with federal authorities. The digital recorder was missing from his belongings, though his wallet, medication, and the backpack were found nearby, suggesting that whoever killed him had taken only what they came for. The crime scene investigation revealed tire tracks suggesting multiple vehicles, indicating Klein had met with someone voluntarily before the execution, though whether he understood the meeting's purpose or believed he could negotiate some kind of arrangement remained unclear. However, Klein had anticipated this possibility with the same meticulous planning he had applied to financial schemes throughout his career. Before leaving the safe house on July 11th, he had uploaded the complete audio files from the digital recorder to a secure cloud server using an encrypted connection from a public library in Wilmington, and he had sent the access credentials to a journalist at the Philadelphia Inquirer whom he had known casually through community connections and trusted to handle sensitive information responsibly. The journalist, a veteran investigative reporter named Robert Chen, who had covered organized crime and corruption for 2 decades, received the encrypted email on July 12th, but didn't immediately understand its significance. When news of Klein's death broke on July 15th, Chen accessed the files and spent the next 48 hours reviewing more than 40 hours of recordings that contained not just testimony about Greco's operations, but detailed allegations about law enforcement corruption that went far beyond anything the federal prosecutors had been pursuing. When those recordings became public on July 29, 2019, published by the Philadelphia Inquirer with extensive analysis and corroboration from independent sources, they detonated like a bomb through the Philadelphia law enforcement and political establishment. Detective Luis Ferreira was arrested on charges of obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and accepting bribes, after the recordings detailed specific instances where he had provided advance warning of raids and investigations to Greco associates in exchange for cash payments that Klein had personally delivered on 3 occasions. Assistant District Attorney Catherine Reynolds resigned 48 hours after the recordings became public, before charges could be formally filed, though the investigation into her activities continued and eventually resulted in her disbarment and a plea agreement that included cooperation against other corrupt officials. Most significantly and devastatingly, the recordings revealed that Vincent Greco had learned of Klein's location in the Wilmington safe house through a leak within the U.S. Marshal Service itself, a betrayal that prompted a comprehensive internal investigation and ultimately led to the arrest of a clerical employee named Barbara Stevenson, who had sold Klein's whereabouts to a Greco intermediary for $75,000. Stevenson had access to witness protection databases through her position in the administrative division, and she had provided not just Klein's location, but details about the security protocols, Garrett's visit schedule, and the family's daily routines. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Marshals Service and led to a complete overhaul of database security and personnel vetting procedures. The Greco trial proceeded in September 2019, though the proceedings were dramatically different from what had been originally planned. Klein's testimony was presented through his extensive recorded depositions, the audio recordings he had made in the safe house, and the thousands of pages of financial documents he had analyzed and annotated. The prosecution also introduced evidence of Klein's murder as demonstration of the Greco organization's willingness to kill witnesses and obstruct justice, strengthening the conspiracy charges that might have been more difficult to prove without that dramatic proof of criminal intent. Vincent Greco was convicted on 18 counts, including racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice, and he was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole before serving at least 38 years. 7 of his top associates received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. Klein's family remained in witness protection under enhanced security protocols and at a new location that was known only to the highest level officials in the Marshals Service. Julie continued working in healthcare under her new identity, though friends from the victim support services said she never fully recovered from the trauma of watching her husband's decision to testify destroy their family and ultimately cost him his life. Michael eventually graduated from a state university under his new name and moved to the West Coast, maintaining minimal contact with his mother and sister. Ashley eventually returned to basketball after a 2-year absence from the sport, playing at a small Division III school under her new identity and finding some measure of peace in the familiar rhythms of the game, carrying the weight of her father's sacrifice with every game and every season. A burden that shaped her into a fierce competitor who understood that some principles demanded everything and that her father had paid that price so others wouldn't have to.